Hi there, welcome to today's webinar brought to you by the Cyber Hut. We'll just leave it a minute or so for people to join and then we will get started with today's content. Hello there, welcome to today's webinar brought to you by the Cyber Hut. In today's webinar, we're going to be taking a look at why the modern organisation needs next generation IGA, identity governance and administration. We've got a wonderful special guest from ConductorOne, Mr. Alex Bovee, who I'll introduce in a second. But before we do get started today, a couple of housekeeping tasks to start with. Clearly, we are on Zoom today, so everybody is centrally muted, but of course we do have the chat and Q&A functionality available to us, so please add your questions and comments in there as we go through today's webinar, and we will have some time at the end to answer and review all of the questions and comments that we get. This webinar is also recorded, which means we will be sending a copy to all of our registrants after the event in a few days' time. So you will receive a nice MP4 at the end of today's session as well. Today's agenda, we're going to go on a bit of a journey. Identity governance and administration has been around for a long time, at least 20 years in various different guises. And it's evolving as most things do in the identity and access management sector. And we're going to go on a bit of a journey to really understand the challenges facing today's complex modern enterprise and the sort of technical and business challenges that they are facing, which is really warranting a huge innovation in how IGA is being deployed. And we're then going to go through looking at some of the requirements and some of the capabilities of what that next generation looks like before concluding with a bit of a discussion on identity security posture management in general. So quick introductions before we dive into today's material. This has been brought to you by the Cyber Hut. For those who don't know, the Cyber Hut is a boutique industry analyst and advisory firm. We are based in the UK, but have quite a large global presence, and essentially we deliver a range of buy-side resources to help and understand the complexities of the identity and access management world, from our IAM squared industry analysis map through to our podcast and our IAM radar reports and curated headlines as well. And we deliver a range of different buy-side resources. In fact, this week we've just recently released our most recent report focused on identity threat detection and response, which is certainly another emerging sector to be following. But today I've got an absolutely special guest, Mr. Alex Bovee from ConductorOne. Alex, welcome. How are you?
I'm doing great, Simon. Thanks for having me on.
It's great to have you on as well, Alex. I've known you for quite a while. It's been fascinating to get to know you and the ConductorOne story. But I guess maybe just let's start off with some basic introductions to your history and how you ended up at ConductorOne and what's the ConductorOne's vision, I guess.
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to share it. So my background is in cybersecurity and in product in particular. So I've spent most of my career building cybersecurity products across mobile and identity, and really decided to start ConductorOne because we saw companies, obviously aggressively adopting the cloud and going through these digital transformation projects and sort of adopting SSO and MFA, but then realizing that really wasn't sufficient to secure identity. We've done sort of all the right things, so to speak, that we've been told to do from a security standpoint in the cloud, but identity breaches and identity-based attacks are still a leading cause of breaches and data loss in enterprises today. So clearly something's not working there. And at ConductorOne, we really believe that identity security just needed a new approach all up, particularly for that cloud forward modern organization. And so we've really started our company with the idea of helping to secure that modern workforce across IGA and PAM and ITDR based sort of use cases.
Yeah, it's been fascinating from sort of as an analyst perspective to see these two worlds collide, if you like, the sort of cyber world and the identity world, both overlapping from both directions. You know, identity typically was employee focused, productivity, the LDAP guy in IT operations doing some stuff, and you know, security was this other end of the spectrum, if you like. Whereas now the Venn diagrams of security and identity very, very much overlapping, and it's really interesting to see the benefits that the likes of security operations, security control assurance, the benefits they can receive from identity, and sort of vice versa, how some of those security best practices now are becoming part of identity as well. It's certainly definitely a different world to it was even sort of 5 or 7 years ago.
I think that's right. I think the change also is somewhat forced by the architectural shift of the cloud as well. It just used to be that security was, you know, writing firewall rules and focused on detection and kicking JIRA tickets over to peer organizations to address vulnerabilities. And the reality is that in the cloud, identity truly is the new perimeter. It's the kind of center of gravity, and the way that you have to secure your organization starts and ends with identity and access control and authorization management. So I think that shift has necessarily brought about this change in security's job, even like, oh, our job now is the center of gravity of that is identity. And let's think really hard about how we get the right practices in place to secure our identities in our workforce.
Yeah, that's a really nice quote. The center of the gravity. I think that's a really good one. And I think as well that the most practitioners now they understand that. They understand that the power and the benefit of identity and being identity centric, which maybe 6-7 years ago that wasn't necessarily the case. It was all about sort of zero trust and moving from network perimeters to something new, and nobody quite knew what that was. Whereas now it's actually, if you look at a lot of the zero trust architecture, for example, it's heavily reliant on identity, you know, strong, clean identity, profile management, authorization, authentication, etc. So yeah, I definitely think there's a real awareness that identity can power the security landscape and obviously do some good things for the business in there as well. So I want to set the scene a little bit, if you like. I always quite like to sort of do the where we were, where we are, and maybe where we're heading to potentially over the next sort of 5 or 6 years, I guess. But clearly in the yesteryear, going back to say 2000, go back sort of 2 decades, I guess, identity infrastructure was fragmented, and unfortunately probably still is quite fragmented in many organizations. Risk was very much focused on detection. You were looking for bad things, typically after they'd happened. Data silos, there was identity data distributed in different locations, databases, homegrown apps, mainframes, none of it was particularly well connected. That resulted in really bad visibility. Organizations couldn't really see where their identities were located, how they were being used, what permissions they should have, etc. And that resulted in things like this tick box compliance sort of way of thinking, way of working, which again may still exist in some places. And we sort of moved forward and made some pretty good technical progress, I think, over the last 15, 20 years. And I sort of say where we are now, sort of going back maybe 2018 and obviously going ahead a year or two. But back to what we were saying now, we're definitely seeing the rise of this identity-centric view, aren't we? But whether it's looking at security or looking at usability, identity seems to be now more foundational, I guess, than it was. Is that fair to say? It's benefiting the business and security, I think.
I think so. I think that's right. I think the other thing too is we see, you know, despite kind of the where we were here, the idea that, you know, identity was fragmented in the past. I think you made this comment. It still might be. We sort of see the exact same thing with companies today. It's everyone's on their own journey around consolidating to a single directory, or at least understanding the inventory of identities across human users and contractors and service identities, and sort of an automation journey across access control and lifecycle, and automation journey across privilege management. So I think where we're heading is interesting, in that there's a lot of really goodness that we can achieve from having great user experiences and really focusing on automation, and focusing on a single source of truth, and sort of an inventory around identities and permissions, just as an example. But I do think there's almost another slice to this, maybe, for the modern enterprise, which is, and me specifically, I am, I would love to step one, tie my shoes, just understand all the identities in my environment, and kind of start with that journey in particular, maybe, and then move on to some of the pieces, from a sophistication standpoint later on. So I think there's like multiple dimensions to this, and you're sort of on a different journey depending on where you are there.
Yeah, I think that's important, isn't it, to realize it is definitely a journey. I think, I'm amplifying that visibility aspect. I think maybe 5, 8, 10 years ago, the visibility, it could sort of be ignored a little bit, because maybe we did have, maybe applications were siloed, and maybe they didn't have the communications or the integration that is needed today. And we used to go into offices, we used to have data centers. You didn't necessarily have that huge sort of federated boundary. Maybe supply chains weren't quite as complicated as they were. So I think it's easy to criticize the past, and we all do it, of course. But I think today those issues become more significant, because we are in a really hybrid, dynamic environment. We have these strange supply chains where we have joint ventures, partnerships. You're relying on others to deliver services, and how the heck do you manage identity across these different areas? And I think absolutely the cloud acceleration of the last 3 or 4 years, remote working as well, another one, they suddenly amplify that actually, wow, these basic foundations that you describe, if they aren't in place, they have quite a big cascading effect, because if you don't have visibility, you can't control. You have a security breach, or you're non-compliant from an audit perspective, and suddenly the problem cascades into other parts of the business where identity probably didn't really have a right to be part of. Application ownership, business development, certainly compliance, audit, and reporting for sure. So I think you're absolutely right. It's about getting those foundational basics right. But I think, unfortunately, the impact of not doing that stuff is now just, it's more significant than I think it ever was, which is why we're seeing change, I guess.
I think there's been two. I was just thinking about a term to try to describe this, and I'm gonna coin it today. That fragmentation singularities, and okay. I think there's been two of them in the past 15 years. One was the initial migration to the cloud, and so if you were a company started before 2016, you probably had at some level like an Active Directory on-prem. The promise of the cloud was to move a lot of your identities and your access control there, and ideally at some point kind of decommission that on-premise directory. But the reality is most companies are in some sort of a hybrid life cycle around that, and so they live in the both worlds. And so that was a singularity where, okay, now we've got both things to manage. And then I think the other fragmentation singularity was just the proliferation of SaaS applications, and sort of there's an app for that type of approach to doing business and productivity and infrastructure in the cloud. Many companies are not just in one public cloud, they're in 2 or all 3, or whatever the case might be. They've got tons of accounts in AWS. They've got users signing up for SaaS applications on their own, and so that has also created this fragmentation singularity where there's no kind of like closing Pandora's box there as it relates to like cloud adoption, and so we just have to embrace that world, I think, and really try to figure out, like, in that world, how do you govern that, and how do you make sense of it, and how do you make sure that it's as secure as it can possibly be.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And you can't reverse this stuff. You can't, put the genie back in the bottle, or you can't do it, because, as you say, the proliferation of SaaS, or the proliferation of cloud, shadow IT, shadow identity, it's really hard to reverse that stuff. And I think organizations now think, well, I can't stop that, but I need to control it. I need to be understanding what it is first, and then, as you say, wrap governance, control, permissions management, and workflow around that stuff. And there's definitely change. There's definitely change in identity across all parts of the capability lifecycle. And certainly IGA is a real big part of that. And I think as organizations face these challenges, that is another innovation trigger. I think there are the way that organizations do business is altering, but there are the technical challenges. There are things like remote working, supply chains, and other, which is really forcing organizations just to think differently about IGA. So I want to try and unpick a little bit as to where we're heading. And the first thing I want to pick out is the modern organization, to define modern, but I think most mid-size organizations, they are going to face numerous different technical challenges. And I want to pull out a few of these from an identity perspective, really. And I guess there are two sides to this sort of spaghetti junction we're looking at here. One is the identity types. 15, 20 years ago, we had one identity type, employees. Maybe used to have a separate schema for contractors. And that was it. I was there, I used to do workflows, build them in XML, they had contractors and staff, and that was it. Dead easy to do. Suddenly now we have partners, we have the gig economy, we have temporary workers. We don't necessarily touch about citizens and customers, but that's another sort of thing to think about. And then there's machines and services and other stuff. So instantly we've got different types, and those identities are not, as you said, stored in one on-premises directory. They're going to be stored all over the place. Multiple directories on-premise, maybe private cloud, maybe one or two systems are reliant on a cloud directory, which they're fully capable and really are popular. But as you said, we're often in this hybrid area where you need to manage both of these ecosystems. You need to suddenly have consistent replication or creation and update sort of policies and rules there. So suddenly there's lots of stuff on the left-hand side feeding into this probably quite distributed, probably quite siloed legacy, or certainly classic identity infrastructure. And then on the right-hand side, suddenly we've got lots of stuff to integrate with as well. So you've got SaaS, you've got apps, you've got on-premises stuff, you've got APIs, documents. There's a lot going on. And I think most organizations are struggling to do two things. One is understand the breadth of the identity ecosystem, then the breadth and depth of the assets which they're trying to access as well. So what's your view? Is this a problem which we can manage, or is it becoming too big?
Well, I think one maybe just first principle to embrace, particularly around identities, is to recognize and to embrace the idea that every application boundary is a directory in of itself. And so that's something that we really embraced as a first principle in terms of like how we designed our product, is to think about AWS as a directory. Any SaaS application uses a directory, any infrastructure as a service is a directory. Your directories are directories, obviously. But I think that when you think of it from that perspective, that really helps you embrace kind of understanding and cataloging what are all the identities in my environment, because the reality is that it's the idea of having a central directory that pushes and replicates that out to all these different services is a great idea. But the reality is people can create local accounts, you can create local users, those may not be perfectly replicated. So you always got this divergence. And I think there's simplifications from an automation standpoint that kind of help make sure you're mirroring directories into these other services, primarily so that you can achieve SSO and things like that. But I think the security problem really requires you to embrace those applications as directories unto themselves. So I think maybe that's one piece just to call out on the left-hand side here. I think the other piece that if you just think about those identities then times the assets and the data, you really get this in SQL. There's this concept of a Cartesian join, which is like, I'm going to take a result set over here and I'm going to multiply it by that result set. And so I get an X times Y result set, which is a huge explosion of results. And I think that's a similar problem to what we have right now. around permissions and authorization and sort of access levels is when you take those number of users times sort of the number of permission sets, you get this Cartesian join explosion of the different role assignments you have to your users and the types of data they can access. And so that's a non-human scale problem. That's not something that's easily inspectable. I've got 100 systems and they all have 20 different kinds of authorization, all this kinds of data in it. How do you actually inspect that and understand that? So I think the other piece to this is just recognizing that fundamentally non-human scale problems require automation. And so you really have to embrace, I think, this problem from an automation first standpoint as well.
Yeah, I think that's really, really insightful. I think as the problem gets bigger, it's really hard to stop it or reverse it without having some sort of control, automated control. Maybe drop in the AI buzzword there. It's 20 minutes in. Let's drop AI buzzword. You need
we might as
some
well.
AI drink. You need to have automation or something in there to handle replication, look for changes, look for maybe behavioral issues or patterns. And I think that is really insightful. I think the other one as well is you're right about everything being a directory. And I think typically what I've seen as well is if an application or a service doesn't necessarily find the identity information or the access control information it needs, it will just sprout up. Developers, application owners, or system, they will bypass whatever is not there, and you suddenly then have this proliferation of shadow IT or shadow identity, be it federation and identity coming in, and that gets created locally. It never then gets cleaned up or removed, or you have that shared accounts. It's still a big deal. So there's all this stuff which essentially gets created but never gets removed or managed or taken away. The permissions aspect is exactly the same. It's that case of let's get the permissions to a level where they work and then walk away, never remove them, never change them, never sort of reverse audit. And I think that's where you need to have the automation to look for those patterns. And
there's a good point. I want to jump in here really quickly because you touched on something I think is a really great point as well around there's the user behavior piece to this as well. So this is kind of like an asset type, a little bit of view of like the types and the assets and the core services. And then the reality is that you've got all your people in your company, these actual identities, these human users trying to work through these systems to just get the things that they need to get a service account created or to get access to these different asset types. And so without the right automation and tooling in place and streamlined processes in place, they're going to actually work around that to try to get their job done. So it's almost like you have to embrace the automation piece of it, or it's going to actually create a worse outcome for you because the explosion is going to be bigger and you're not going to be able to audit it because people are just effectively working around your controls because they can't get their jobs done.
Well, that's exactly it, and they will do that, and they will do that for a whole host of identity capabilities. And I think we're really at an inflection point because I think if you get identity right, and some organizations do, and they do get it right, they leverage good authentication, access controls, zero standing privileges, next gen IGA, they use all the capabilities at hand. If an organization can do that, they suddenly then empower themselves. Identity can empower the business to be more productive. It can share data faster. It can collaborate on projects better, more seamlessly. You can share data across boundaries. You can enable your administrators to be more secure. So suddenly these are all business productivity things. So instead of that shadow IT stuff or shadow identity and people circumventing controls because they're too hard or they're too difficult, they don't work. Suddenly, if you get the identity stuff working effectively, the business benefits are huge. And I think we're not quite there yet because I think there are some issues around maybe metrics or how we sort of talk about identity in general. But if you suddenly enable the business, the non-identity guys, to collaborate, data share, go into joint ventures, launch products faster, that's all super, super good stuff from a business perspective through to that board level sort of conversation. And I think you get that right, identity is the hero. I think we're not quite there yet, but instead of it being a problem, it can be the hero. And I think that is super exciting.
Yep, +1.
Alrighty, so organizations do have these challenges, and I think IGA is pretty special. I think you go back 20 years. we had the old focus around, you know, spreadsheets being used to sort of list identities and work out the permissions, and you have that access review process, which was it done intentionally? Maybe it was done a little bit for things like licensing. It's good to, I remember years and years ago working in an organization, working in the directory services arena, and it was a big deal really to work out who wasn't using the system, because it was a few dollars per head on your licensing cost. You've got 30,000 identities. It's a pretty big deal if you get that stuff wrong. So that was where IGA was focused. Whereas now, based on the sort of problems we've been describing, suddenly the problem statement for IGA is bigger. So what does that mean? Well, IGA has to deal with more things. It has to do more stuff. And I guess the big one, which we see constantly, both across different parts of the identity world, but also on the buy side, is everyone's moving to the cloud, or has moved to the cloud, or is somewhere in between. But it's definitely not a black and white style conversation. We're definitely seeing this hybrid angle. I mean, what's your view here? Will this hybrid nature exist? And I guess to the viewers, in your hybrid, we're talking about maybe some on-premises aspects, maybe running in a private cloud native, maybe within containers, for example. But it's privately run and owned. At the other end of the spectrum, of course, maybe there's going to be software as a service or a cloud service provider, which is, you have less control over that stuff. But are we on a journey, or do you think this hybrid aspect where we have both and multiple sort of steps in that spectrum, is that here to stay, do you think?
I think every company is on their own journey there and has their own goals around digital transformation, and whether they want to move full cloud or sort of live hybrid. Most companies, the reality is that technology adoption life cycles are long and hard. And even if you want to move fully to the cloud, most companies struggle to untangle. Think about all the applications, services, and so forth that are powered by your hosted or on-premise infrastructure. It's probably a ton, and that's the reality. And so I think the best solutions in this space today are going to embrace that world and not require and not give you an answer for just one or the other, or have a really great experience over here but a terrible one over here. Because I think the reality is that everybody's on, back to that original slide we went through, everybody's on their different journey in terms of directory migration, directory consolidation, authentication rollout, just-in-time access, and permissioning. So if you look at those different spectrums, what you don't want to do is have different point solutions across those different spectrums for different scenarios and use cases, because then you end up with really this hodgepodge of experiences, some of which might be great, if you're in the sweet spot of a particular capability, but then some are going to be absolutely terrible. So I think we really need to embrace the world as being messy, embrace that some companies are fully cloud, some companies are hybrid, some companies are, sort of fully hosted in their own private cloud or their own infrastructure, and really just and not sacrifice on the experience and the capabilities that you provide just because of the architecture itself. That's my personal opinion from a how to build great products and solutions standpoint.
It's interesting. I mean, I guess there's an effort on your side, I guess, as a vendor to be able to do that and be able to, I guess, plug into different ecosystems, which I suppose is a challenge or cost to you as a vendor. I do feel, I don't think it's a one or the other. I agree in the sense of organizations will have to deal with this landscape for a long time. I don't think we suddenly see everything in the cloud or everything in the SaaS or everything in whatever. I think there's legitimate reasons for having a mixed architecture, which I think is the same with most technology aspects. Really, you tend to have a mixture, certainly the larger you become. So I think that is here to stay. Yeah, I certainly think in certain instances, maybe cloud first is a noble strategy to have, but even that is not all clouds are the same, as we know. So I think that in itself is differentiation there. So I think you're absolutely right. Whatever service or integration you have, it's going to have to work in a multitude of different ecosystems. And I think more importantly, it has to be consistent, which is what you were describing there, both from an end user perspective, But I think as well from like a management, an admin,
Yeah.
implementation, development, extension perspective, UI, reporting, it all needs to be the same. You can't have, it works amazingly for, I don't know, AWS, but on-prem it doesn't work at all, or vice versa. So I think it's got to be consistency.
Exactly. I mean, companies are already struggling with the proliferation of just complexity in general.
Yeah.
Why add more complexity in the process and management, sort of Venn diagram, if you will, of how to manage access and identities by having things forked depending on, oh, if public and if SaaS then this, or if IaaS then that, that just adds additional complexity and kind of management nightmare. And so I just think in general, we have to help companies and enterprises really simplify complexity and eliminate complexity, not add on to it. And yeah, I'm very inspired by that in general.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that's fair. All right, the other thing which I think is an interesting topic is this the conversation historically about PAM, privileged access management, very targeted on privileged accounts, routes, administration accounts, shared accounts, service accounts, and quite rightly they needed managing, mainly because the risk of impact for this stuff was, keys to the castle. The impact would be big, would be cascading. The blast radius would be larger. But suddenly now, are we in this world where all identities essentially are becoming very important? And individual identities for the standard user, we have identities which maybe set up accounts or manage things within these cloud infrastructures, cloud infrastructure identities, sort of semi-admin accounts or automation accounts. All of this stuff has real power. And again, adversarial activity, they don't break in, they log in, they will take a standard, Simon's standard user account, leverage that to log in, maybe then do a pivot or an escalation somewhere else. So should we start thinking that all identity information and identity account information, should we start thinking that it has the power to be a privileged account at some point? What's your take on that one?
The answer is yes.
Okay.
And the double click there is that I think there's, along with the migration to the cloud and these application boundaries, there's been a shift in terms of what privilege means. The old primitive. So let's think about like the old privilege as a privilege access management. You would have a -A account, or you'd have a special account that was your privileged account that had permanently associated with it escalated permissions. Someone would check that privileged account out from a central system, which typically meant getting the credential, and then they would log into the system, they would perform whatever privilege actions they needed, and then ideally they'd go back and then tell the privilege access management system that they were done with it, and hopefully that credential got rotated. And so the idea was that your root of trust in that whole flow is that credential. The reality is that with SSO, and particularly in the cloud, the credential is your initial authentication to the IDP service that is then you're then SSOing into that downstream system. And so the key there is that it's no longer about the credential check-in and check-out and sort of life cycle around the credential. It's actually about the life cycle of the permission itself and the level of access. And so that has shifted. And I think a lot of companies don't quite recognize that shifted yet. We sort of ran to adopt the cloud and adopt infrastructure as a service and so forth. And as a thought experiment, if you think about your cloud IDP, whoever you might use there, if you're in the cloud, that your cloud IDP administrator has God mode permissions. They can change your SAML mappings in your application so that they could log in, pretty much as any user into whatever application is connected to it. From a SAML perspective, they could escalate permissions and access control using whatever SCIM is provisioning downstream to the system. So if you're doing group-based access control and authorization to AWS, and that's connected to your cloud IDP, guess what? Anybody who can administer that group in your IDP effectively is like controlling escalated permissions to your cloud infrastructure. So you kind of have to trace back think about from a threat and attack perspective, how do these modern attacks happen? Well, lateral movement is effectively SSO, and breaking in is just getting access to that user's identity and being authorized to perform actions. And so I think it really has shifted, and I think our mentality has to shift away from sort of these legacy ideas of sort of checking in and checking out credentials to much more, how do I temporarily elevate permissions and levels of access to perform privileged functions, and then remove that when we're all finished with it.
Yeah, that's a really valid point. I think the other sort of second double click on that is the visibility, isn't it, of those identities and the privileges. Organizations struggle to be able to see stuff. I mean, I think Pam, I guess, did a good job historically of saying, right, okay, well, let's just focus on a very small subset of identity, and we can label that and we can classify it. And I guess the lens was quite focused there, but that isn't the case now. As we've said, identity information is everywhere, it's distributed, it's in different locations. It all essentially could have the potential to have high impact. And yeah, how do you see that? I think that's something we'll double click onto, I think, in the next sort of 5-10 minutes. We need visibility. We need to be able to see the systems, see the identity, see the permissions, work out differences, and at that point we can then start to make informed decisions around automation or workflow or whatever. But I think IGA, the problem statement is getting bigger, which I think is why we're having the conversation around, well, it's innovated now to a point of the existing solutions really aren't delivering what is needed. And a bit of fun. It wouldn't be a webinar if we didn't bring in a bit of chat GPT action. So as always, let's ask chat GPT to do the webinar. It'd be interesting, actually. I guess in a couple of years' time, I'll probably be made redundant and be probably an automative version of myself. But I did ask chat GPT, what does it think about next generation IGA? And it's a bit of fun, I guess, but it does actually pull out some quite interesting aspects, as you would expect. I guess by design, the fact that ChatGPT is able to answer amplifies the fact that next generation IGA is a thing. It's well understood. It knows what those current challenges and problems are, and is obviously in turn delivering some sort of requirements and solutions here. And there's a couple which I want to pull out. I think being adaptive is good. I think being responsive and adaptive to what's happening, pattern detection, looking at anomalies, looking at issues with access and permissions and the associated access there. Automation we've touched on a little bit, but the two that I've highlighted there, self-service and user-centric experience. These are not necessarily things which you would immediately associate with IGA version 1 from sort of 2010 or whatever, where it was all about compliance reports, dog ugly things to use, terrible user interfaces for the approver. The approver just would tick everything and approve everything because the UX was so terrible. Very difficult to engage the right people at the right time, whether that was for access request approval or access review approval, or maybe looking at application owners or system owners to interact and get their help on things. So, what's your view here? It seems to me self-service and user centricity, it's a sort of secret sauce really to allow things like IGA to be successful and proliferate and get the right people at the right time involved. What's your view on this one?
I think that's right. I mean, I think if you tying this back to a few of the themes that we talked about, automation, user behavior, sort of meeting customers and environments where they are and not forcing a change or a different experience based on the different environment. I think that's the key sort of underlying principles here is radical self-service and a great user experience is really what you need to address that user behavior issue, right? If I can't get it, and if I can't get the things that I need, and if I can't get them effectively, I'm just going to work around the tooling. And so I think this next generation of IGA really needs to recognize that user behavior and embracing the users around having great experiences and being able to efficiently accomplish their goals really needs to be paramount to kind of these products and experiences, because adoption is critical. And if you can't get the users on board with the products, it doesn't matter. Users find ways to work around security tools. And I view IGA at the end of the day as a security product at some level. But I think that's Yeah, I think that's just very apropos to that user behavior piece. Is you gotta give users experiences that they like. You've got to help them do their jobs more effectively. And if you get in the way, they're just going to work around it.
Yeah, and I guess practically that's what it's using things like Slack, Instant Messenger, integrating with different systems. I guess being available where the end user wants it to be available, I guess.
I think that's right. It's meeting your users where they are.
Yeah.
Modern technical teams are typically in their command line. They're in their terminal. Your modern users are in Slack and in Teams. Being able to, I'll sprinkle a little AI dust on this, but be able to, kind of use AI to enhance those experiences and create really great experiences around self-service or around contextual access decisions or providing risk context to users making decisions on access control. I think those are the pieces that we can really provide great experiences there. People are gonna love the products. They're gonna use them more instead of trying to work around them.
Yeah, that context one's really important, isn't it? I think in context during access request approval. So the person approving it is like, well, okay, who's Simon? What's he want? Why does he want it? What's he done previously, or maybe what are what his team members doing? Do they need the same access? Has he used this access in the past? I guess it's providing the approver and the requester with just more inputs, isn't it?
Yeah.
They shouldn't have to make decisions, I guess, too much. That sounds quite a bad thing, but
Well,
I guess
the biggest the biggest complaint that I always hear from security and compliance folks is like, people are, they're approving things that they have no idea, or say it's an access review, you have no idea what it is that you're even looking at. And most people are hesitant to take that away because they don't want to break something, or they don't want to, sort of cause problems. And so they're more likely to just, approve access requests and so forth. But that really doesn't help you achieve that least privilege goal or secure your organizations. I think the context piece is so important to that.
yeah, I think that's a really valid point. All right, let's change gear a little bit then. There's a few things here on the sort of requirements angle around sort of next gen IGA, and there's three that I really want to amplify. I think one is, we've touched this a little bit, is this hybrid coverage, and I think what we're talking about here. Well, I think this modern IGA arena has to do a few things. I think one is clearly be deployable in different locations. It's not just a case of being prescriptive and only being deployed in cloud or in a particular on-prem ecosystem. I think it has to be deployable in different places. But the ability to ingest data and touch those different systems, and identity data clearly is going to be in a variety of different places. On-prem, off-prem, but equally APIs, flat files, databases, directories. You mentioned earlier, everything's a directory, but it may not look the same. It may well be in a different format or certainly stored differently. And why? Well, clearly identity stuff is just going to be distributed. You're going to have good, clean, replicated directories, but you're going to have hard-coded stuff which hasn't been touched, hasn't got an owner, isn't under the control of anybody. And you've got this proliferation of sort of shadow identity, if you like, which needs to be managed as well. So, yeah, how do we do this? How do we get our tentacles, if you like, into these different systems?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the hardest technical problems actually of a modern governance solution is you just went through it, right? But all the different complexities and permutations of different systems, from your SaaS application that has a modern set of APIs to your database that's using, that's really storing and managing authorization and permissions and users and roles like natively in the database itself. And so those are just, all of these different systems have different ways of managing authorization. Some have modern experiences for exposing that information, APIs, some do not. And I think really the goal though is to connect to all of that technology, because if, again, with the sort of vision being, we're going to have a singular unified governance and privilege access management experience across all of our technology. If you can't connect to all of your technology, that's kind of a non-starter there. So happy to speak to the ConductorOne solution. We've solved this problem in a unique way, which I think is very cool. but I do think that this is a very hard problem, and just you need to be able to connect to all of your technology.
Yeah, I think it's the ability to connect and I think empower the people doing it as well. Whether that's through tooling or SDKs, APIs, or whatever. But the people who are managing or understand these systems the most, they don't necessarily. You want to make it easy for them. Essentially, again, back to the context thing. Give the person who understands that system the most the tooling and the knowledge to connect to it, to read it, to manage it effectively. I think that is always going to be a winner, I think, in most cases. And certainly over the last 15, 20 years, there have been different projects and different ways of connecting frameworks and other things to try and, I guess, distribute the way of handling this and making sure the knowledge is in the right hands and building those communities and ecosystems. But I don't see this being fixed. And by that, I mean, we're only going to get more systems. You're only going to get more deployment scenarios. We're not even talking about stuff like services and IoT or things where there's identity data in other esoteric places. So yeah, being flexible, integration, connectors, frameworks to help, I think is got to be the way forward.
The challenge here is on that technology integration piece. Just a quick comment maybe before we move is you kind of want you want an adaptive experience for being able to integrate. Obviously, for a lot of out of the box technology, you just want something agentless that just connects to the technology, to where you should be able to connect to, let's say it's a support portal or a back office application. You have an on-prem commercial off-the-shelf application that doesn't have modern APIs. You need to be able to integrate in that with that technology as well. And it should be, depending on the level of complexity, the complexity of the integration pattern should kind of match that. And I think there's been a lot of solutions to this, I think, in the past that have just made very broad assumptions, like every application has an API that roughly looks like XYZ. It has this format or whatever the case may be. And I think that you just end up bumping into places where, oh, this doesn't work for this particular application. So now that's a one-off solution, or we've got to go kind of off the paved road to integrate with that technology. And I think that creates a lot of problems and headache.
Yeah, everything becomes an exception then, doesn't it? And suddenly back to that coverage and visibility thing, suddenly you've got multiple systems because they don't communicate or talk or whatever. And I think, we definitely need to normalize that, I think, as much as we possibly can. And a couple of other sort of requirements, if you like, which we sort of touched on a little bit, is this joining up of IAM and PAM, if you like. And I think there's a couple of ones I want to pull out here. Is this movement, if you like, on the stealing of concepts from the PAM world, like just-in-time access and zero standing privileges or permissions, where these were 5 or 8 years ago just for the domain of the privileged access management world, just giving access contextually after a request has been approved, but then you're removing permissions. These sorts of concepts, they seem like they're proliferating and really need to be within the IGA space as a de facto. What's your take on this one?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that with this sort of modern lens of thinking about identities and permission management and authorization management, when you take a step back and then you start to look at the traditional IGA space and the traditional PAM space, the use cases start to look really similar, right? So onboarding users, offboarding users, escalating permissions and privileges, these all just look like the same processes across different applications. And I think the sort of boundaries between those traditional spaces is blurring a lot. So I mentioned, just as an example, kind of your IDP administrator, making sure that making sure that you're able to escalate those permissions for the IDP administrator just in time so they can perform privilege access, means not granting too much permission via birthright, means making sure that you're also offboarding and removing that access either through periodic user access reviews or proper offboarding if a user leaves or an employee leaves the company. So I think that these are all just they're kind of use cases on the spectrum of lifecycle management of identities and permissions and authorization that really just need to work for all applications all up and all technology all up. And so we definitely view that as a convergence, and we view it more from a use case standpoint, like what is the use case you're trying to solve, and a lot less from the kind of, the traditional acronym standpoint. Because I think at the end of the day, customers have use case problems. They don't have acronym problems.
Well, they do, because they're not sure what acronyms are. That's the big acronym problem.
Right.
They just rock. But no, that's fair. I think, yeah, use case led, and again back to the business requirements, isn't it? Again, what's it trying to solve, and what's it trying to do, and I guess what happens if it doesn't get solved. That's another way of thinking
Exactly.
about
Yeah.
things as well. And the other acronym, let's dive into the one, POLP, Principle of Least Privilege. Again, something which used to be quite esoteric, quite separate, automation really of removing bad permissions essentially, and getting to this principle of least privilege where you have need to know basis essentially, but removing this issue of privilege abuse, privilege escalation, maybe sharing accounts because you don't have the right permissions to do stuff, but essentially getting to a position where you're removing the excess, applying and adding in permissions dynamically, that just in time thing with context. But I think that back to the context thing, improving the self-service request. So you're only requesting the stuff which you need, which you know about. You're not doing a blanket request for everything because whatever your access isn't working. Using things like time-based access associations, either removing something after a period of time, or maybe contextually. So you get something based on maybe you're working on a project, maybe that project finishes, the stuff's removed, or maybe you're working on a particular JIRA ticket, and when you finish that ticket, your access is removed. So can we get to principle of least privilege? Is it a dream, or can we get at least a bit closer to it?
I think we can get there, and I think actually the world has to get there, and it has to get there because of the changes we talked about earlier, which is this migration to the cloud, and kind of the identity really truly being the new perimeter. So when you think about how this used to be managed, you might be a little bit less concerned about excess permissions because you had this layer of security, which was a VPN, and you had segmentation around it. And so you could, that was kind of your walled garden, if you will, around enforcing some level of kind of like how to escalate privileges or get access to privileged resources and infrastructure. And I think that's really changed, particularly with the cloud adoption. And so I think, moving away from granting too much birthright access, moving to just-in-time escalation, identifying overly permissive access and removing that in real time, that's actually the way that you achieve much more of a right level of access for the job that you need to get done. The key underlying all of this at the end of the day is automation, because I think the challenge is the vision is good, the vision is real, but the problem is if you can't automate most all of this, then you actually can't achieve it because it's too expensive. It's prohibitively expensive from a clicks and calories standpoint, right? So if every single time you wanted to remove access, there's 2 hours of work, and every time you wanted to request it, there's 2 hours of work. Guess what? Like you're really not going to want to remove. You're really not going to want to remove and make people request access more often. Whereas if you can get that down to, it's a single self-service click, and contextually a system's able to verify that someone needs that access, and it's auto approved and then auto provisioned, then you can move to much more of a just-in-time access and truly like principle of least privilege access. But I think automation is the key to all of this.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. I think you're right. It's automation again, but taking some of those concepts we've had for a long time and just applying them to more systems, more people, more accounts, more identities, and that will hopefully get us to somewhere more usable and secure. And we're sort of wrapping up towards the end here, and let's introduce another acronym. I think that's always a good thing to do. Identity security posture management. It's essentially where we're sort of ending up. We've talked about the modern enterprise has challenges. They've got lots going on. We've got the cloud thing going on. We've got all this complicated identity infrastructure, which is being either full of misconfiguration or being it's too manual or lack of visibility. We've got some good concepts we can steal from other places, and we sort of smash that together in a next gen IGA approach. But are we looking at this new modern security posture management aspect where we have improved visibility of what's going on? we have something more responsive. And by this, I mean, we're tying into the business essentially. Let's apply the right access to the right people so they can go and do their job essentially. And does this then deliver something more consistent and adaptive? Or is this just yet another acronym and we don't need any more of those?
I mean, it's a little bit of both, but but I do like the idea of really calling this a different thing, because I think the acronym soup of the past is not leading to the outcomes that companies want, right? It's not actually leading us to a more secure world with more secure identity and a secure workforce. It's kind of not delivered on that promise. And so I think at some level we do need to kind of shake up the acronyms a little bit and say, what are the use cases and the problems that companies have? How do we solve those? And what's a comprehensive solution to be able to solve that? And I think you really have to look at what are the best parts of IGA, what are the best parts of PAM, what are the best parts of ITDR, and how do we stitch that together in a unified way that's going to provide our company with secure identity and access control across all of our systems, hybrid and cloud, across all of our identities, contractor, user, service account, whatever the case might be, across all of our resources. And I think it really does require just a more comprehensive view of the problem. Like, we need to be a little bit more visionary, I think, in terms of how we want to solve these problems versus, again, sort of highly point solution oriented for, if you are in the cloud in its infrastructure, then we can do access reviews really well, or we can do self-service provisioning for SaaS applications very well. I think we need a much more comprehensive view across that to solve the problem holistically.
Yeah. I think the being comprehensive and being holistic, I think those things we have to achieve as an industry. I think, you know, you're right in the sense of identity is too powerful now. It's powerful for the business, which is great, but it's powerful for the adversaries. You know, they can leverage it in a bad way. So I think if we can be more comprehensive and include more things, and automate more things, and just apply a blanket or a cloak of whatever, call it what you will, ISPM or automation of best practice, I think by design that's going to result in something more consistent and adaptive for sure. Alex, has always been a fantastic meandering conversation on next gen IGA. Certainly learned loads from this conversation and others. I guess coming to the end of our sort of time together here. Any questions people may have, now is the time to answer them in. There's a couple of questions come through, actually. One from earlier, actually, about ITDR. I mentioned ITDR at the top of the call, I guess. Looking at not really too clear what this means. What are the identity threats? Well, I guess it's a slightly off topic from what we discussed today, but I guess the best thing is to reach out and have a look at our most recent report on ITDR. Actually, that describes it in a bit more detail. But certainly there are definitely some interest there in things like runtime behavior analysis and a bit of posture management there as well. You know, looking at those existing identity associations and making sure you are just adding in the correct permissions, making sure you are removing accounts that aren't being used, permissions that aren't being used, and be more dynamic, I think, in how we manage identity, I guess. Another question, how do people get started on this next gen journey? I guess either from a ConductorOne perspective or just sort of conceptually, what would be the first thing?
I mean, I think the best way to get started is just to, I think, identify what pain you want to start with. I think one of the key requirements of a next generation IGA solution is really quick time to value and rollout. So I think that's a big shift there. Just to call that out is we, as an industry and as sort of security professionals, I don't think we can really tolerate these like 2-3 year long rollouts before anybody sees value from the investment. So you really have to have a quick time to value and roll out an implementation for whatever solution you're looking at. And then I would think about it in terms of what are the things we want to make better first. You know, do we want to enable self-service? Do we want to enable continual compliance through automated user access reviews? Are we trying to achieve our least privilege objectives? Are we trying to streamline user onboarding, offboarding? Do we just want to get a grasp of all the identities and permissions within our environment? Do we want to focus on detecting threats and potential risks in our environment and remediating it? So I think it's about thinking about that sort of, you know, where's the biggest bang for our buck as a company right now in terms of where we are in that maturity journey across these different elements, and how do we want to deliver value to the business, and then think about what platform or what product do we want to partner with that's going to be with us through this journey and help us when we decide to, okay, now we're great with self-service, let's move on to this, let's move on to least privilege access or whatever the case might be. And so I think that's the way that I would think about it is what is that identity roadmap for really modernizing identity and access control and governance and securing identity all for your organization, and how do you want to execute on that?
Yeah, no, that's really, I think that's a really great place to end. Again, as always, you tie it back into those business objectives. Where's the business heading, and how can identity help? I think, and that's always you get your identity infrastructure running smoothly. I think the benefits to the business are much easier to report against, which I think is a win for everybody there. Alex, absolutely been a fascinating conversation. Thank you for coming along and sharing your wisdom and insights. There's a few links here at the end of the webinar, which we'll send this out to you in the coming days, so you will get access to the recording of this and some interesting links to follow up with ConductorOne or the Cyber Hub for any further information on details. This has been a really fascinating conversation, Alex. Thank you for coming on and sharing. Any last minute quick pointers before we close up?
No, I appreciate you having me on, Simon. Thanks. This is great chat.
Thanks, Alex. Well, thanks everybody for listening. And until next time, wherever you are in the world, stay safe, and we'll see you later. Thank you.
Great. See you.